Yeah, hi everyone, my name is Stefano Braghiroli. I'm Associate Professor of European Studies at the University of Tartu, Institute of Political Studies. I'm originally from Italy. It's already 12 years that I'm here in Estonia. Among the things that I do, I teach quite a lot of courses that relate to European integration, the role of European Union, the relation of European Union with others. I also happen to manage a master program. It's called European Studies. It's the only Estonian language that we have here, Estonian language program that we have here at the Institute. And I also engage with a few projects that relate to, again, European integration, Europeanization, illiberalism, and regionalism in Europe. Well, I would say that when I think of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the way it impacted Estonia, maybe I think of two main trajectories. One has been clearly a very strong sense of solidarity, a very strong sense of commonality with Ukraine, which basically means that there has been a very clear sense of what we can call rally around the flag effect. I think that the society has been very unified by Russia's full-scale invasion, in demonstrating quite strongly its solidarity with Ukraine. Then after, of course, we can discuss a bit more about the complexities of Estonian society, also when it comes again to ethnic diversity and so on. But overall, it has had a shaking impact, and I would say that pretty much everyone in Estonia was shaken by that. And in general, there has been, both at the level of political forces and the level of the texture of the society, this idea of doing the best to express solidarity to Ukraine and also ensure our safety and security. The other one, I would say, has more an impact on Estonia's projection on the outside. And here, not only Estonia, I would say the Baltics in general. For many, many years, the Baltic states have been repeating almost to exhaustion, well, Russia is a threat. Russia poses a threat. And of course, let's say the volume of these has increased after the first war that Russia started against Ukraine in 2014. But overall, the reaction of mainland Europe, of what we call old Europe, I'm not a fan of this term, but let's say old Europe, has been, well, yes, we understand that you have this very bad experience when it comes to Russia and the Soviet Union, but we can probably play constructively with Russia and build a relationship which might not be, let's say, friend to friend, but let's say pragmatic. There have been some references to Estonia and the Baltic suffering of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disease, after the Soviet experience. I would say that after February 2022, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania had not only the moral right, but also the, let's say, the tangible evidence to go to the Western European partners, to North American partners, said, we told you so. I would say that, in fact, they were smart enough not to simply focus on the point, we told you so. But after saying, we told you so, I think that they came up with quite concrete ways on how to, let's say, move ahead and how to respond to this. And in that sense, I would say that the fact that the Baltics had an experience, a painful experience of dealing with Russia and dealing with attempts of Russia, even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, to destabilize the country and to infiltrate the texture of the society, well, let's say they had a recipe in a moment in which everyone was very much taken aloof. I would say, let's be very frank, also in the Baltic states, beyond the I told you so, many expected that Russia would have been doing something in Ukraine in February 2022. So again, everyone was saying that, the expectation was there. Of course, there were more skeptics in Western Europe, many more who expected this to come here in the Baltics, in Estonia. But I think that very few expected this to come so powerfully, so in the shape of a really full-scale invasion. And even here, that came as a shock. But of course, less than in other contexts. Well, I think that if we want to distill the content in really like 2 minutes, is the fact that, yes, the moment will come in which Ukraine and Russia will have to negotiate. Most likely, the war will not come to an end, let's say, in a in one side winning all and one side losing all. Although we might wish, let's say, a full victory of Ukraine. But one thing is very important. We can expect to negotiate in relatively fair terms, whatever this means with Russia, if we are in a position of power. Russia is absolutely not interested in negotiating fairly, in negotiating in an honest way, provided that someone who wants to destroy you wants to negotiate in a fair way, unless it's forced to do so. And the only way in which Russia can be forced to the negotiating table, not simply try to play games and to basically achieve what it cannot achieve on the battlefield from the table, is basically if we negotiate from a position of power. This means that that's what basically was the content of the letter, we need to double down on supporting Ukraine. We need to increase our determination in doing so. If some allies, even the most important one, somehow become less reliable, we should try to basically back that up. And at the same time, we have also tools to destabilize Russia if we want to do so. The question is whether we have the political will to achieve that. But simply the point is that this is more and more not only about Ukraine. This is about, I would say, the stability and the security of Europe. And I really want to, maybe if I can here, extend one thing, because somehow Europe is a quite diverse continent. And of course, the feelings that we might have here in the Baltics are fairly different from the feelings that you might have in France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain. And of course, here, the threat of something coming in case things go bad in Ukraine is much closer than you might have in Madrid, in London, in Paris, and so on. However, I would say that we should really realize that if something happens in this region, be it the Baltics, be it Poland, be it, let's say, the broader eastern flank, I'm not saying that tomorrow we will find the Cossacks in Paris, but I'm just saying that we will all live in an extremely different world, and a world that we won't like. All that we know from NATO, from what we take for granted European integration, from what we take for granted in terms of, free movement of people, trade as we know it, would be shredded, that's for sure. It would be a cataclysmic change, and it would be a change that we wouldn't like, for sure. So even if we don't fear the Cossacks in Paris, I think that in Europe it's important that people realize that if Ukraine loses, then our direct security is at threat. Well, I mean, when it comes to the role of the Nordic Baltics, I mean, broadly of this region, when it comes to supporting Ukraine, I think that there is a very easy explanation why they are so committed in doing so. In fact, two. One is proximity, and the other one is, of course, experience. Proximity means that, as I said before, both the Baltics and the Nordics very much are along the eastern flank of the EU and NATO. Most of them have direct border with Russia, and most of them have seen what happens to Ukraine when Russia crosses the border. Again, it's no surprise and no mystery why Finland and Sweden, after basically a fairly long history of neutrality, or at least non-alignment, decided basically to join NATO. And the other one is, of course, experience. Of course, experience which was more tragic in the Baltics, occupation in the interwar period, well, after the interwar period, the beginning of World War II. Everyone here had someone in the family who either was deported to Siberia or was killed or somehow experienced the painful follow-up of Soviet invasion. In the case, of course, of Finland, again, that's another interesting case. Finland tried to build a pragmatic relationship with Russia after, in fact, fighting a war for its survival in the 40s. That was a process called Finlandization. That was the best Finland could achieve after not losing the war with the Soviet Union. And that seemed to work during the Cold War, in which that was imposed on Finland, and after the Cold War. But of course, again, when you see how Russia treats its neighbors, then you start thinking, to what extent am I safe? And maybe here one thing, sometimes you hear that Russia just wants, that's at least what you hear from the Kremlin, Russia wants friendly relations with the neighbors. I would say that Russia, and I would say this very much goes back to the imperial DNA of Russia. I do not think that we can, let's say, think or conceive Russia as we know it today unless as of an empire. And this has to do not only with how we conceive Russia, but also how Russia conceives itself. And the point is that Russia understands only two types of neighbors in terms of relations. One option is that the neighbor becomes somehow a sort of subject of Russia. I mean, it doesn't have to be invaded, but somehow functional to Russia's interest, meaning, let's say, trying to adapt itself to the desiderata, to the wishes of Russia. So in that case, all good. This is what Russia defines a friend. The moment in which you want to have your own will, then you become an enemy. So Russia does not understand with its neighbors, I'm not talking with, let's say, United States, Canada, or I don't know, Brazil, but with its neighbors, which were part of the empire or of the Soviet Union, an equal relationship. If you want an equal relationship, you become an enemy or at least a competitor of Russia. Yeah, well, I would say that, we all know that Article 5 works until you call it. So let's say the magic is there, and somehow we really don't know, obviously, how it would practically work. But for sure, again, then I go to the maybe last 10 years and to see basically how Estonia relates to NATO, how Estonia relates to transatlantic integration, and also how basically it understands its role there. But maybe, let's say, I want to stress that when it comes to Estonia's path after the reacquisition of independence, Estonia basically wanted to avoid the mistakes of the interwar period. And the mistakes of the interwar period was primarily to be alone. Which basically means that when Estonia re-emerged out of the ashes of the Soviet Union, Estonia wanted to be as integrated as possible, as at the center as possible of alliances. And the alliances were primarily two: European integration and transatlantic integration. And of course, when it comes to transatlantic integration, it was primarily about security. And of course, Article 5 was seen as the ironclad shield that would have protected Estonia, and finally Estonians could feel safe. Now, of course, as we see in the recent months, maybe now things look a bit less safe, but that was basically the goal and the idea. So obviously, when Estonia joined in 2004 NATO, that was the moment in which I think many among the Estonian elites and also among the public said, finally we made it. Now we are safe. Now we can basically focus on building a successful state because we are under basically a security umbrella. NATO is the strongest alliance in the world, and no one will dare to touch us. That's basically how it was communicated and it was understood. Maybe I just recall like one momentous speech, if I recall correctly, I mean, was 2017, 2006, maybe a bit earlier actually. No, actually, sorry, 2015, after the annexation of Crimea and Russia's invasion in eastern Ukraine. Barack Obama came to the Baltic states, came to Estonia, and gave a speech which was actually seen as very reassuring for Estonians. And the passages I think everyone remembers was basically the following. Barack Obama basically said, like, to us, to US, and to the transatlantic community, Riga, Vilnius, and Tallinn matter as much as Paris, London, and I suppose Berlin, I don't remember. But anyway, the message was very clear. You matter to us as much as any other NATO country. And this, of course, was something that many wanted to hear here. Now, at the same time, maybe, and here I conclude this, this thought, we should also remember that until Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the plan that NATO had when it comes to the Baltic states was very clear and very scary at the same time. The Baltic states were too detached to be fully protected in case of a full-scale invasion. So let's look at the worst-case scenario. Should Russia attack the Baltic states in 2017 with full power, there would be no way in which, obviously, the local armed forces and even some of the allies, not many that were here, could stop that. So what NATO takes for granted is there would be a moment in which the Baltic states would be invaded, and then the idea is to retake them. Which, you know, doesn't sound like a particularly exciting scenario. After 2022, the perception and the approach has changed. So the idea was basically to push for having a credible force here that could prevent Russia from taking over the Baltic states. That's why you have NATO enhanced forward presence. That's why somehow you have a remarkable number of NATO troops here, primarily European troops. And also that's why the idea was that on the one hand, you have what you call active deterrence. And on the other hand, of course, having such a large number of Western European or North American troops here, you also had a sort of life insurance, because the moment in which Russia attacks, then Russia would also directly target these troops, and this would directly trigger this country into the conflict. I would say that if we think back of the Estonian party system and the party system's attitudes towards European integration, Euroscepticism, illiberalism, and so on, when we look at that, I would say that we have a sort of line of division. Traditionally, Estonia has not been, when I say Estonia, I mean the party system itself, has not been a party system in which, let's say, you could find a lot of what I called romantic pro-Europeanism. So Estonia has never been a country in which European integration has been seen too much in terms of, let's say, ideal attachment. On the other hand, every political force, with very few exceptions, understood that European integration is very much in the interest of Estonia, and Estonia is only to gain out of being part of the process of European integration. So there has been a fair amount of, I would say, what I call pragmatic pro-Europeanism. And this has been the case for quite a long time. Some parties were, let's say, more, let's say, pro-deepening integration. Others were satisfied with what was there, but I would say overall there was a consensus. I would say that starting from the 2010s, that kind of, let's say, general consensus has started to slowly erode, slowly. And I would maybe highlight three moments in which that happened. The first one had to do with, let's say, what we used to call the Eurozone crisis, in which, let's say, as we all recall, countries from Southern Europe, especially, again, Greece, started somehow to be very much in very cold water and need somehow support and assistance from fellow member states. And here there was a clear perception, while of course solidarity was important, in general the discourse has always been in the Baltics, if we want solidarity, we need to give solidarity. So that was never taken out of the table. But the understanding was that somehow Greece was somehow the main source of its misfortunes. And while the political system tried, especially the forces that were in government, tried basically to play along the European consensus, among the public there was a perception of why should we help the Greeks if the Greeks basically do not pay taxes, are somehow not very much doing their job. And this, again, I think the best representation of this was the way in which the former president of Lithuania put it. Greeks' pensions are higher than Lithuanian salaries. Why should we help the Greeks to keep such high pensions? And so this was one moment in which European integration started to become a bit more contested. The second one obviously relates to the 2015, 14, 16 refugee crisis. So the so-called Balkan routes and how that was weaponized. Again, I would say that here primarily the debate was basically grounded on politics of fear. I mean, the Baltic states never had any direct inflow of refugees. It's important to say that the Baltic states, unlike the Visegrad countries, played the voice card and not the exit card, so basically meaning that they played by the rules, there were quotas approved, the Baltic states took their quotas, of course tried to minimize the numbers, but overall played by the rules. And somehow, while this was done by the book, by the political elites, certain parties started to oppose that quite vehemently. And on the other hand, again, among the public, what you could see was a quite tangible degree of opposition. And the last one has to do with what we can call, let's say, the gap between materialism and post-materialism. There are a number of aspects from, let's say, rights to LGBT community, to environmentalism, to, let's say, in general, sensitivity towards certain groups, that European integration is seen as caring. And this has somehow cut across, let's say, the society in terms of liberal versus conservative. And I would say that this also came in a moment in which what we have seen pretty much all over Europe and in fact North America and, let's say, the advanced democracies is coming also in Estonia. So the society is becoming increasingly polarized. Culture wars are becoming more and more part of the patterns of the society. And overall, I would say that in a context like Estonia, in which ideological polarization along left-right has never been so strong. I mean, yes, you have social democratic parties and, let's say, conservative parties, but ideology has never been the main vector of politics. On the other hand, what we have seen more and more is a gap between liberal and illiberal forces. And this is basically what dominates at the moment the political spectrum in terms of party politics. Maybe the last thing on this, what we also notice is that starting from 2017, a party in particular, which is called the National Conservative Party of Estonia, which is the most Eurosceptic party and illiberal party that we have here in Estonia, has had access to government. The reason for this primarily relates to the fact that the outgoing prime minister wanted to stay prime minister and basically compromised with the far right in order to stay in government. But basically, nowadays, that party has become one of the main political forces in Estonia. And basically, it's a party that is clearly playing with illiberalism, with Euroscepticism, is also collecting, let's say, political inspiration from other parts of Europe and the other sides of the Atlantic. And I would say that nowadays the Estonian political system, party system, is very much really aligned along two fronts. Again, you have a liberal side, very clearly liberal, and that is what is in government nowadays. These are the three this is the most liberal government Estonia ever had, with three very liberal parties: the Social Democrats, Estonia 200, and the Reform Party. And on the other hand, you have three parties that, in different ways, are very much embrace a more illiberal message. ECRE, this Estonian National Conservative Party, I already mentioned. Then you have another party more on the conservative, less on the far right side, which is called Pro Patria, which is also fairly illiberal, or let's say in any case like social conservative. And then another party, the center party, the smallest of the three, which also somehow tends to share some illiberal perspectives. And I would say that overall, what the illiberal side is playing with is very much with the fact that there is a perception in a, I would say, relatively relevant portion of the society that there is a section of Estonian society which is not taken care by the liberal front. And in a way, I would say that this is a sort of debate that you have in other contexts, from Europe to North America, that basically what used to be, let's say, what the main target of the let's say, of the social democrats, of the center left, of the progressive, which is basically, say, the middle class, the working class, and so on and so forth, now become less relevant for them, and they start to focus more on micro interests. Be it, for example, I don't know, focus on LGBT rights, be it maybe, let's say, of some minorities, but not, let's say, of the majority of the society. And with that, I would say that the far right, the Eurosceptics, and overall the liberal front is playing quite a bit. Yes, we had a case, say 2 Januaries ago, of a colleague who was detained by the Estonian security service under the accusation of espionage. I will not comment on the case specifically, but I mean, I can simply share with you that I, as every one of our colleagues, has been made aware of these circumstances first by the leadership of our institute, and then basically, in fact, in the same day, during the same day, that became also part of the public domain. Of course, everyone was shocked, and everyone really became really affected by this news. So clearly, it was came as a cold shower for all of us. We knew the colleague very well, and somehow, of course, none of us could have expected that. In terms of how, let's say, the case that then in fact came to a conclusion, and of course on this I can definitely share with you what the conclusion was. So our colleague was condemned by the Estonian justice system for not only colluding with Russia, but basically for undertaking tasks on behalf of the Russian security services, which related, of course, to espionage. Now, what does this tell us about what Russia wants to do? Well, I think this confirms what we pretty much know. Russia wants to interfere with the way in which democratic societies work and wants to undermine them. I mean, we see that in many ways. We see that through misinformation, in fact, disinformation, through hybrid, what we call basically hybrid warfare. We saw that when it comes again to interference or, let's say, penetration into European politics and party politics. And we see that when it comes again to academia. Now, of course, here we are not Fort Knox. Here we don't, let's say, develop secret plans to conquer the world. But I think overall, what Russia is also interested in, and that can be captured in the context of academia, is say, what are the main debates at the level of societies? What is the general feeling at societal level? Again, academia interacts also with policy making. Academia interacts with, let's say, society, with organized society. So let's say it's a good vantage point to get the pulse, let's say, of a country or of a society. Now, maybe 2 things that I would like to highlight when it comes to, let's say, what happened to us in general. The first one is that I would say that this happened to us, and I would say the reason why we understood that this happened to us, or we, let's say, while the security services understood that this happened to us, is because Estonia poses a lot of attention to this. So meaning that I think that Estonia, both at societal level and in terms of, let's say, security and political apparatus, as good antibodies to detect cases like that. The other side of the coin is also that I frankly don't know how many cases like this there might be around Europe, and I'm no expert in these matters, but I suspect that by being many cases like this. But I also suspect that in other countries, I think for example of Western Europe, there might be much less attention and much less of those antibodies to be able to detect that. So I don't think, let's say, what happened here should give us any sort of shame or, oh my God, it happened here. That I think it's more a matter of, we discovered that because we paid attention. Maybe this is a wake-up call to other academic, and not only academic, and can be medias, can be, let's say, any sector of the society in which, let's say, information matter, maybe to pay a bit more of attention. Not about, to say, witch hunt, of course. It's more about, let's say, being attentive and understand that Russia is no friend to us, is no friend to liberal democracies, is no friend to open societies. And the problem with open societies, which is also its advantage, open society is open, but by the fact that it's open, is also much more vulnerable. I would say in many, many ways. We could spend hours talking about that. But I would say that, well, especially because the past year we celebrated our first 20 years inside the EU. Let's hope many more will come. I think that overall, what European integration has given to Estonia is primarily, let's say, as I mentioned before in the context of NATO, a sort of stepping stone to bloom, let's put it in this way. So I think that European integration has provided Estonia with the fertile ground to then basically develop and grow and kind of, become that success story that Estonia has become. I think Estonia has searched the deepest possible integration inside EU, as I said before, not because of romantic pro-Europeanism, but simply because Estonian political elite understood very clearly that the more at the center of European integration you are, and the more successful you will be in terms, let's say, of picking the fruits of European integration, of gaining and profiting from European integration. I think that Estonia has also matured quite a bit inside the EU. I mean, I always tell my students when we talk about enlargement, when we talk about, again, that 2004 enlargement, that maybe we should really abandon certain type of terminology. I mean, it's not rare nowadays when you read newspapers or, let's say, listen to the medias, to the news, that they refer to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland as the new member states. And look, it's 20 years that Estonia is member of the EU. Finland joined in 95. When someone was referring to Finland in the EU in 96, no one was calling Finland a new member state. So first of all, I would say that there is still, and here I'm primarily referring to Western audiences, an understanding of a visible/invisible gap inside the EU. That is the new Europe and the old Europe, and is still there. And I think that this is something that should be very much, let's say, relegated to the dustbin of history. I think that in some respects, the countries from this region has gotten out of the EU as much as they have given. I think, again, if I think of the contribution, and here I go more to the other side, so what Estonia has done when it comes to the EU, I think that they have managed to upload quite a bit. First of all, because the Baltic states, unlike, for example, countries of the Visegrad group, which has been seen always as sort of kind of, the bad pupils, have always behaved, let's say, have always been very rule-abiding. The Baltic states have always played by the rules. The Baltic states have also undertaken steps which were problematic to justify in terms of internal politics. I mentioned before the refugee quotas. I mentioned before, again, for example, assistance to Greece. That wasn't absolutely popular at all here at home, but it was understood that if you want to have a stake, you need first of all to play by the rules. Of course, comes without saying that the main contribution of Estonia to European integration has been about, let's say, smart economy, has been about digitalization. Again, we could speak a lot about that, but again, this comes almost without saying. I would say that after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, one of the main contributions of the Baltic states has been to wake up the rest of the EU, and also to help to shape a strategy when it comes to, let's say, supporting Ukraine and countering Russia. And maybe the last thing, I would say that the fact that nowadays the EU foreign policy is led by an Estonian, which, let's say, if you think of the not too long Estonian independent history from 1918 to today, represents the Estonia that ever in the history of humanity has reached the highest position in an international setting. Well, I would say that this is a tangible evidence of the fact that, well, the Baltics have grown up. Of course, let's also be very frank. I do not think that without Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Kaja Kallas would have been appointed as representative of the EU for common foreign and security policy. But at the same time, again, circumstances also shape our present and our future. So we are what, let's say, the circumstances make of us. As I mentioned before, I think Estonia and the Baltic states have had the chance to affect EU decision-making more than their actual weight in many, many areas. Again, economies, digital, when it comes again to, I don't know, networks and so on. But there has been one area in which the Baltic states traditionally have been much less able to impact. And this was EU foreign policy, and more specifically, EU strategy on Russia. Why? For what I was mentioning before. This idea that somehow the Baltic states were suffering of this post-traumatic stress disease, of this somehow painful history, and so somehow they were a bit too obsessed about Russia. Now, things have changed after 2022. So I think that after 2022, exactly because Western Europe, generally, again, you think of the Franco-German tandem of Berlin and Paris that shape, now that of course London has left, shape basically the direction of EU foreign policy. Well, the point is that after February 2022, for a few months, Berlin and Paris were in a state of shock. So very little happened from Western Europe. There was not much of a reaction apart from, let's say, obviously harsh declaration. What we have seen, I would say, for the first time has been that this side of Europe, Baltic states, together of course with Poland, have been able to take, let's say, Western Europe by the jacket and push more and more Western Europe towards their side. I would even say that, of course, size-wise, it's very hard to say that the Baltic state did more than Poland, let's be frank. Poland is one of the largest member states. Poland is a country that's put quite a lot on the table. Poland is a country that is also a military power in the region. However, I would say that the Baltic states, and in particular Estonia, has potentially a better selling point than Poland, and has had that for quite some time. Poland has a size on its side, but Poland had also a very troubled political situation at home. Of course, now we have the liberal government of Donald Tusk, but we had for quite some time a fairly illiberal experience under the PIS and with Kaczynski and so on. So the point is that traditionally Poland had a quite complicated relationship with the EU, with Brussels, and not an easy relationship with its neighbors, particularly Germany. So let's say for Poland to go to Western Europe and say, look, you need to do what we do because we are fighting for democracy to support Ukraine while at home building an illiberal state, there is a bit somehow of dissonance. On the other hand, the Baltic state and Estonia in particular have been fairly consistently on the liberal side. Also, when Estonia, for example, experienced some illiberal tendencies, again, when the far right was brought to government or when somehow went into coalition with more mainstream parties, there was no tangible, let's say, erosion of the democratic texture of the state or democratic texture of the society. So in that sense, I would say that there was a bit more of credibility. Now, if we think of what that implied, yes, for sure, let's say both the credibility of the Baltics and the geopolitical situation was what made the appointment of Kaja Kallas as High Representative of the EU Foreign Policy possible. Let's also stress another thing. If we think of the current setting of the EU Commission, we have Kaja Kallas as High Representative, we have Kubilius from Lithuania as Commissioner for Defense and Space, and we have basically the Finnish Commissioner that takes basically care of what we can call challenges to democracy and democratic resilience. So it seems that this region is very key to the security-focused discourse at the EU level. So that's one thing. When it comes to Kaja Kallas specifically, I think that maybe I would mention two things. The first one is that she was put there exactly because she came from this region. So when I hear, but Kaja Kallas might be too Russia-focused, well, Kaja Kallas was chosen exactly because she was too Russia-focused. The main threat for the EU has been and is Russia over the last 3 years, and I don't think that the situation will change. Now, this doesn't mean that Kaja Kallas is not able to talk about other contexts. I mean, of course, Russia is not the only threat, and of course, the war in Ukraine is not the only challenge the EU has to deal with. I mean, we have a tragic situation in the Middle East. We have, of course, other areas of instability. We have recently a lot of instability coming from the other side of the Atlantic. And I mean, Kaja Kallas has an experience of a former prime minister, has an experience, let's say, of a good negotiator, and clearly has proven able to, let's say, sustain positions that do not relate only about Russia. And here maybe the second point of thought, which relates both to, again, countering Russia at a global scale, but also, let's say, to be able to speak to other parts of the world. One of the big problems that I think the EU and in general the West has experienced has been, let's say, to promote its narrative, let's say to sell its narrative beyond the West. So Russia has been traditionally fairly successful to engage with the global South, while the West has been quite, if not unsuccessful, but let's say only partly successful to, let's say, counter those narratives with the countries of South America, Africa, Southeast Asia, and so on. And I would say that one of the big reasons behind that is, of course, Europe's past sins. I mean, let me put it this way. If a Spanish high representative goes to South America and says, look, Russia is a colonial power and somehow behaves towards Ukraine in an imperialist way, well, I mean, of course, the point is true and is a real point. But at the same time, you know, what credibility can have a Spanish high representative? I'm not saying that, you know, by being Spanish you are naturally guilty. That's not the case. I don't believe in transfer guilty from generation to generation. But clearly, of course, that matters, you know, when you bring a certain narrative. And I think Kaja Kallas, on the other hand, can have a good selling point when talking to African leaders, when talking to South American leaders, and say, look, I come from a country that, like yours, was a colony, that like yours was exploited, that like yours faced deportation and heinous crimes. My family was sent to Siberia. Part of that family didn't return, exactly as your family was exploited, and suffered violences. So I think in that sense, she has an argument that, let's say, leaders coming from other sides or other parts of Europe might not have. Of course, how much this argument will be heard, because let's be frank, of course, let's say sensitivities matter, but economic and other types of interest also matter. But I think that this is a selling point that she might be able to exploit or to use in certain circumstances. One thing that I want to stress is that when we think of how Russia engages with non-mainstream parties, I think it's important to say that when I talk about non-mainstream parties, Russia has tried traditionally to engage with parties on both sides of the aisle. So we see, and this is something that I always found very fascinating, that Russia tries and traditionally managed to engage with parties that traditionally were, if not enemies, competitors. So Russia has good relations with Marine Le Pen of Rassemblement National. At the same time, Russia tries to cultivate good relations with some communist parties in Southern Europe. And obviously, let's say, Marine Le Pen and the communist parties are really not good friends, or traditionally are not. What we noticed with a colleague of mine, Andrei Makarichev, was that Russia engaged in what we called trans-ideology. Basically, the idea that Russia was able to communicate with those political forces and the audiences that relate to those political forces through different communicating channels that remain somehow compartmentalized. So, for example, when Russia was talking to the far right, traditionally the arguments have been, traditional family, strong leadership, sovereignty, and so on and so forth, traditional values and so on. When talking to the radical left, on the other hand, anti-fascism, anti-Western narratives, and so on and so forth. And the two sides were kept, let's say, separate from each other, and it worked. I would say that increasingly, since both the far right and a relevant part of the radical left, not all the radical left, but a part of that, have become increasingly illiberal and are increasingly looking at the liberal center as the main enemy, Russia has increasingly abandoned this idea of separate communicating channels, because now it can use fairly similar narratives to both sides. But this was basically the background. Now, in terms of relation of these parties with Russia, I would say that before Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, at least in Western Europe, having relatively open, friendly relations with Russia wasn't particularly costly in electoral terms. I mean, if you think of Italy's, I don't know, the League, or France, Rassemblement National, or again, in Germany, Alternative für Deutschland, these parties were openly pro-Russia. It was no secret to anyone. They had even, in many cases, formalized, I call it like a memorandum of understanding between United Russia and the parties. And overall, again, there wasn't too much public scrutiny of that. They didn't pay a big price, and overall the electorate wasn't very much touched by that. In fact, might even be in favor of that. I would say the situation changed quite a bit when Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine took over. And here I would identify maybe three phases. One phase was when the war was just about to start, and almost all these parties basically started to play with skepticism. They're telling us that the war is coming. Even today, nothing happened. So somehow try to mock the fears about a start of a full-scale invasion. When the full-scale invasion actually came, what we see is that they tried basically to distance themselves quite visibly from Russia. So no more pro-Kremlin narratives. Some of the parties, not many of them, froze or cancelled those memorandum of understanding and so on and so forth. Maybe either hide, put under the carpet, or dropped open connections to United Russia, and of course engage in relatively empty declarations of solidarity towards Ukraine. And this, I would say, was for the first couple of months, maybe the first 6 months, I would roughly say. When, especially in Western Europe, on the other hand, the cost of supporting Ukraine, I don't like to say the cost of the wars because the only one that pays the cost of the war is Ukraine, but let's say the cost of supporting Ukraine at some, let's say, trickle down at the level of society. So let's say the general public support for Ukraine, which was there at the beginning of the war, started somehow to erode a bit. They very much jumped on that. And what they did was basically to repack what before was, let's say, a Russia-friendly argument in terms of national interest. Well, we need to pursue peace because that's in our interest. We cannot keep helping Ukraine because Italians, French and German come first. We cannot keep pushing new sanctions because otherwise our companies and our, let's say, enterprise will close down, and so on and so forth. So basically repacking what had traditionally been their main lines of thoughts, but this time primarily in terms of, let's say, national interest. And again, that can be declined in different ways. The war cannot be won, peace before all, and so on and so forth. But overall, again, this, I would say, is the third phase that we have seen. And of course, now what we see is a sort of contagion of this third phase in which this type of narratives move from, let's say, the non-mainstream increasingly to the mainstream in certain countries. But I think we are still in that phase of transition. We are getting into a fourth phase, basically.